Hello and welcome. Hello and welcome to Varn Blog. And today I'm talking to Tim DiMuzio, um, of Associate Professor of International Relations and Critical Political Economy at a university in Australia.
University of Wollongong.
I was like, oh, and your bio actually didn't mention which university you were at. And we are talking a lot about your article in Strange Matters on inflation, and then a bit about your book on carbon capitalism, and the relation between the two, because it's hinted at in your article, but not really gone into explicitly. So to start us off here, how would you describe the shift and the basic assumptions of the quality theory of money that the Fed has operated on? Because I have noticed that theory hasn't changed, but the explanation for why it's true has actually changed a great deal.
Right. So it's very difficult to tell in some ways because we can only rely on the statements that they relate to the public. And internally, there's obviously a dialogue going on that we're not privy to per se. I think the interesting thing to focus on here is if power is nothing but its effects, focus on the effects. So I don't necessarily care why they're making a justification for increasing interest rates. I mean, obviously they make the claim that ostensibly it's supposed to quash inflation, which is what the article is about, and I'm trying to investigate that, and I go back to the Volcker shocks to kind of test whether or not this is accurate, right? And of course, from the empirical detail, it's not. So it's kind of like a little bit. I kind of conceive of it as the Wizard of Oz. There's this little guy. He's really a man. He's not really a wizard, and he's pulling these levers, behind a curtain that no one really can see. And occasionally, he might get exposed. And when they get exposed, they come out and say they're going to either decrease interest rates or increase interest rates. And it's a very, very crude kind of mechanism to basically, if you want to call it this, control the economy, right? Whether that's quashing inflation, keeping prices stable, which is one of their goals, or keeping employment at a certain level, which is also one of their goals. So I'm not very concerned about kind of I guess the economic theory or academic theory, whatever you want to call it, for them doing these maneuvers. It's more, I guess, the effects that them doing anything, whether it's decreasing or increasing interest rates, have on the broader economy. And that's obviously a very, very complex thing. But nonetheless, the theory is still held by these people that, increase interest rates, slow the money supply, slow loans, make money more costly. That will help quell inflation.
What I find fascinating about this is that it's transparently, both theoretically and empirically, at least null, if not just maybe the opposite is true. Increasing the cost of credit increased cost in general. The prior theory, I'm going to state this for the audience, the way it was articulated when Volcker articulated it is that it increases savings removes money in general supply. There's more money for direct investment because of the savings, and blah 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 blah. That's obviously not true now at all, and the Fed knows it. Their current theory that they seem to be picking up is what is called labor conflict theory, which comes out of Sweden, which is a Keynesian Marxist hybrid theory that explains the cycle based off of demand for wages, etc. Except that there's also no empirical evidence that that is true either. That's all been more or less unconfirmed, Laffer curve kind of stuff. So what I find interesting about your article, though, is like there's plenty of empirical evidence that the primary driver of inflation is supply, and beyond that, the cost of moving supply around, so carbon. And all major inflationary shocks since we've moved off of not commodity money, because that's not really what even commodity-backed money was. Since we moved off of the Bretton Woods system, have been caused by the cost of energy.
Yeah, that's right. I think even the Federal Reserve knew that in the 1970s, and there's some debate. There's two wonderful articles that are overlooked, but are in. I actually excavated them. One's in foreign policy, and I think the other one's in foreign affairs. In the 1970s, and one is by a fellow called Oppenheim, and the other one is Edelman. And basically, they're like, "What? Like, there's no oil shortage. What's going on here?" And what they both kind of argue in their different ways is that this was actually strategically done by the United States. They wanted to push the price of oil up. They used OPEC as a cover, or what was called the tax collector, primarily because the major oil companies were losing oil fields because of the nationalization of oil in the global south or developing world. And then also because they were forced out of those countries, or at least forced into negotiations where they were kind of only helping with technology and so on and so forth. They had to find new fields. So, for example, the North Sea. That's a huge technical operation, takes a lot of money. These corporations are prone to going into debt in order to develop their assets and so on. So it was reasoned at the time, and again, this can be debated, that the United States, as a strategic venture, wanted that price of oil to go up by 400%. So what changes the game then, right? And we see this in kind of, I think, the last graph in that Strange Matters article, as I map inflation and oil price and so on. Fits very, very nicely. As soon as energy prices, particularly oil, start to come down, so does inflation, right? Because obviously we're an oil-based society, or oil-based civilizational order, if you like. So you increase the cost of that fundamental unit of energy, you're going to increase the prices across the board, because capitalism fundamentally is a cost-plus accounting system, right? So what happened here? Okay, energy prices did go down over time. The oil companies started to service their debts. They got to develop things like the North Sea and Prudhoe Bay and so on. So kind of more inhospitable climates to get your energy from, rather than, say, desert. And then all of a sudden China opens up. And so one graph that's actually not in the article is so the period under study is pretty much from 65, say, to 1980, 85, I think. And so what I did later, and it's not in the article, is I looked at, okay, so when does China open up, right? And as soon as China opens up, the inflationary pressures go down. And of course, because one would assume we start trading with China, it has a cheaper labor force, and obviously that is a knock on prices. So basically we start to see inflation come down in those two ways. One, energy, and then, if you like, really cheap human energy to manufacture our goods that is ubiquitous around the world now.
Right. So, as a critical political economist, that's a fun title. I noticed that your explanation is also different than a lot of the other heterodox economics answers given right now. The most standard one that there isn't really a standard one, honestly. The one that seems to be popular amongst a certain set of modern monetary theorists is Warren Mosler's, that all this is because of a political will issue with the U.S. government basically accepting higher prices at purchase, which they think somehow sets the inflation cost for the entire market. Like their example for this is semi-skilled labor, which I actually do think it might be uniquely true in that case. But then they expand off of things like all commodities somehow are based off of the purchasing power of the federal government, and that purchasing power is really what backdoor is the price setter. I find this to be a hard sell, and then it's not the only answer; it's just the most articulated one. One of the things I find interesting about your framework is that you pretty much accept the cost push dynamic as one of the major drivers, which I think has a lot of empirical evidence for it. Would you like to go into how that might be working right now?
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously the difficulty is we've just been through kind of a once in a century pandemic. So that's obviously kind of an historical exception on some level that some people foresaw, but most did not. So that's obviously thrown a wrench, if you like, in the spanners of the global economy in a lot of ways. As people are sick and there's shortage of workers in certain sectors and so on and so forth. The other thing I think obviously is the war in Ukraine. That's obviously affected prices, particularly for energy, particularly for some food aspects, wheat, for example. And then I think, if you read some of the literature, the idea is, oh, well, demand is back after, the pandemic and so on and so forth. And it's just raging, it's roaring. And, that's one of the also reasons, right? So that's the other side of it, right? So it seems like it's kind of like the perfect storm on some level, right? So you have supply constraints because of a pandemic, and then you have, demand pull because people want to spend money again because they're back to work and they're outside and they're back at the shops and so on and so forth. I'm not 100% sure that I buy that per se, because I think following C.H. Douglas, there's always a limit to people's purchasing power based on their wages and salaries. And wages and salaries are actually a cost to business. So what C.H. Douglas identified, and almost nobody talks about this, is that there's always a gap between the outstanding prices for goods and services on the market and the purchasing power that labor actually has. So, for example, if you probably remember the neoclassical dictum, it's Say's law, that supply is going to create its own demand, and the market should clear. No market's clear. When have you ever gone to a mall or a Costco or whatever, where, there might be a few things missing on the shelf. Maybe everyone bought the toilet paper and all that kind of stuff during a pandemic. But in general, the problem that businesses have is, how do I market? How do I sell? How do I promote my good or service, and so on and so forth? So sales is the issue. I don't think it's the supply necessarily. Yes, there can be disruptions in supply, and that can lead to price hikes. But I think we have to be very clear that the neoclassical kind of idea that there is, an equilibrium point between supply and demand, that sets the price. I don't think that happens at all. From what we know, even in empirical detail, corporations figure out their costs, and then they add a markup, and they charge, as Veblen would have said, what the traffic will bear.
Yeah.
Right. So
price is what you can get away with.
Yeah, exactly. And price is a weapon. Price is a weapon, right? So sometimes you have to kind of lower your guns and discount your price, and you see that when you go to the supermarket or whatever. And same here, with me at the supermarket, it's like, 10% off or whatever, or 25% off. Sometimes they just have to clear it, and they want to make, but we don't know what the margins are. Maybe the margins are 100%. So, maybe when they say 20% off, they're still making 80 cents on $2 or something, Do you know what I mean?
Mhm.
So price is definitely, as classical liberals would say, an information system. It definitely is, but I would argue it's also a weapon.
Mm.
Mm.
And
So even increasing the interest rate, that is a weapon, right?
no,
Like this
absolutely.
is 100% redistribution from the people of the United States, or wherever the interest rates. It's happened in Canada, it's happened in Australia. Wherever those interest rates increase, it's a redistribution of income and wealth to a different class, right? Most people don't own shares in banks. Those banks increase the interest rate. Well, guess what? They're the ones, and their shareholders are the ones who are going to profit off this base interest rate increase. And we saw it, I don't know if you've got a mortgage, Derick, but my partner does. And, immediately, as soon as the central bank in Australia, which is the Reserve Bank of Australia, increased interest rates, immediately the commercial banks were right on it and passed it on to their consumers, right? So, all of a sudden, you go from paying maybe 1.2% on a mortgage to now it's like 2.5 or 3%, which makes a huge difference, right, in people's lives,
So yeah,
especially when mortgage is the largest debt most households or people will have in their whole lives.
right. I mean, so the average rate right now in America is prime now is 6.5%.
Ah,
And
really?
yeah,
6.5.
yeah, that's prime. No, we don't have variable rate in the same way that say
Yeah.
Australia and Canada do.
Right.
And that was a reform mostly out of the 2007-2008 crash.
Okay.
But so what that but Fed policy affects the entire world, not just the United States. Um,
That's right.
I remember discovering, there was a Fed meeting about a price blip in Indonesia, and it's just like, okay, this is not just about the U.S. here, and this is going to wreak havoc, for example, in the Canadian housing market in particular. It's so that I think is I don't think people, and this is maybe sometimes like I critique the heterodox economic sphere for this, where they sometimes treat nations as discrete entities, and don't look at the power distributions between nations and how, there's a reason why the central banks of, say, Japan, of Europe, and of the UK follow the Fed, even if it doesn't immediately make sense. I mean, in the sense for Europe, I mean, we've seen the devaluation of the euro, and then the pound. Oh my God! I mean, it's just like seems to be almost in free fall. So it's and also the decisions that the British central bank, even though its economy is less the size of that of India now, have knock-on effects all over the world. So what the British have decided to do today will probably have also severe effects on the market. Um, and what I find interesting about, I think I have deduced, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, that you come from the power theory of value school of political economy. So would you like to
That's correct.
explain what that means and how you use it?
Right. So basically, there's only, if you look, to literature, and this can be boring for some people, but for nerds like me, it's interesting. If you look to literature, there's only three kind of analytical definitions of capital, and that comes from the neoclassical school, the Marxist school, and then the power theory of value school, which is associated with, which was started by Jonathan Nietzsche and Shimshon Bickler. And they've been working it out over time, but by 2009 they released a book called Capital is Power, which kind of was their form of statement, I guess, and unpacking of the theory. So basically the idea here is that capital really, if we look into it, is two things. One, a money invested in a venture to make more money, or money that can be invested in a venture to make more money. But the thing is, if we're concerned with this, so this is even Marxian accumulation. If we're concerned with that's the goal of business or industry or a corporation, then how do they actually make earnings, right? And that means they have to exert their power over the social order in order to do so. And that involves all kinds of things, including sabotage, the sabotage of production, or sabotage of efficiency, or whatever it might be. So you can, for example, think of, that big scandal that happened a few years ago with Apple iPhones, and they purposely made their batteries, less effective than they otherwise could, right? So you have to buy a new phone, and so on and so forth. So the power theory of value basically says that we can start to think about organized power in the form of corporations as exerting their power and influence over society in order to garner greater earnings relative to their rivals over time. And this is what gets capitalized. So, for example, if I buy shares in a corporation, say Microsoft or Facebook or whatever, I'm kind of betting on the future that they were going to exert their power over the social order in order to garner greater earnings relative to their rivals or other sectors of the economy, and so on. So whereas Marxism explains prices and profits by the exploitation of labor time, this has never really been demonstrated because Marx had to convert time into prices because they're incommensurate units, and that's never been done. And then, of course, the neoclassicals have what's called the production function. So their idea is that the more productive you are, the more remuneration you get because you're contributing that much more to the economy. So, for example, if Elon Musk is worth, I don't know what he's worth now, 170 billion, that means he's, X times more productive than the average janitor or average worker, right? It's nonsensical. There's no way, someone can be a million times more, productive than another human being. Maybe 2 times. I've known some lazy people. I've worked a lot of jobs in my life. Maybe I could say you're like 2 times more productive than someone else. No way, 10 times, 100 times, a million times, and so on. So those theories kind of break down, and I just find the capitalist power theory far more kind of convincing, not only from like a political economy angle, but just for like a human being angle, to be like, step back, look kind of down from the a meta level and go, okay, what are we doing here as humans? How are we organized? And one fundamental question as a political economist or sociologist or even social scientist is, well, how is power distributed, and how is it organized, and how is it, I guess, unleashed on some level?
Yeah, I have gone back and forth from the capitalist power thesis. I think it is intuitively clear. I have some I guess I am still a fairly orthodox Marxist, but I will admit that the Marxist debates on value theory tend to be, even to me, incredibly frustratingly technical about if this or that element of this or that time, or if this or that aggregate stat does this or that looks like what may be described here. And whereas the capitalist power thesis actually does seem to explain things like, I don't know, why does everyone take the US's money? Because, well, we produce a lot of stuff and we have guns. Like it's kind of it's kind of that simple. And it explains certain elements. I think what it's very useful for me is like there are parts of like neo-chartalism and stuff that I'm like, well, why can't small nations do this? Because they can't instantiate autarkist conditions. Well, why can't they do that? Well, part of it is they can't produce enough, but another part of it is they do not have the power on an international scale to compel people to take their currency.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And I think really, and this is kind of overlooked, and you asked me about the Carbon Capitalism book at the kind of outset. one of the things that's really overlooked is just after World War II, as World War II looked about settled, the Allies were pretty sure that they were going to defeat Nazi Germany and Japan. Roosevelt met with King Ibn Saud, and this was in the Suez Canal. And basically, we don't know 100% what was said, but we're pretty sure, there's some writing about this that we can find. And this is, basically the deal was, we'll protect your kingdom. We'll sell you armaments, and you denominate your oil in dollars. Now, at this point in time, there's still a lot of oil in the United States of America, and people still have to buy it in US dollars. But they know that one of the biggest finds is in Saudi Arabia by this point, right? So, insofar as we know, and again, power is nothing but its effects. So let's look at the effects. The effects are, regardless if this conversation never ever happened, Saudi Arabia denominates its oil in dollars, American dollars, and then of course later on other Middle Eastern countries join that, right? So already, if you need energy to develop, if you need oil in particular to develop, you need US dollars. So that creates a huge demand and surge for US dollars already. Never mind the fact that most commodities that travel the world are priced in dollars as well, right? So you need that creates a demand for the currency. And I think when Nixon goes off gold, I don't think he maybe knew it, but his advisors certainly did, that we could do this, we could go off gold, and the dollar is not really going to be that dramatically affected. People will still want to hold dollars. And again, we can make the argument too that the Volcker shock made it more enticing to hold, dollars at this time, relative to other avenues of savings, right, or investment.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, this increased the foreign loans that the third world had taken throughout the 1970s, to the point where in 1982, Mexico has to come to the U.S. Treasury, the IMF, and to go, we can't even, service these debts, let alone repay them, right? Because I think the interest rate got up to about 14%, which is, crazy if if your loans are in the millions or billions, right? So that's a lot of serviceability to do on that level of debt. So that's an interesting thing, because a lot of people think this was not done to quell inflation. This was done to ensnare the third world into a debt trap. So that's it's a thesis I explore in another book called "Debt is Power" with my co-author Richard Robbins. But it's an open question. As social scientists, we can only kind of investigate, have hypotheses, and try and test them. But maybe nothing is ever for certain, and maybe we'll never know these things. But look, I mean, if you think of debt as a kind of mechanism of power, or a technology of power, perhaps more insidious but more powerful than a military. It's certainly ensnared the third world into an international trade network that needs American dollars to service its foreign debts.
Yeah, I think about that. I think to me that's somewhat undeniable when you see the shift in this policy in the late 70s, early 80s, and how that cascades to the globalized debt crisis, the rise of the World Bank and the IMF. People may argue, and I think someone like Michael Hudson has, that you could start an alternative power base to this in China, and there has been some movement for the yuan in this regard. But one of the things that I think has been sort of missed by a lot of people who don't understand these kinds of analyses of power relations and capitalism is that there's been a prediction, for example, for a long time, that this basket case economic scenario would finally get rid of the U.S. and like Europe and so on would be the beneficiaries. That is absolutely not the case. If anything, Europe is increasingly not relevant. And in a very short period of time, we see countries like Germany go from net exporters to net importers within the course of a year, partly out of energy concerns about the Ukraine, but also partly because they really didn't have the power to assert the euro as a aside from and separate from the dollar. I mean, it just was treated as having a special relationship to it. What do you make of these kind of developments? That doesn't come up in your article, but it's something I think about a lot.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I mean, as far as I recall, last time I looked at the foreign exchange rates, the U.S. dollar and the euro are more or less parity.
Yep. Although today they're now at 92 cents. I happened to look it up to come in today, but I was like, yeah. Okay. But they've been at parity for a while, like.
Right. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Look, I mean, it's. I guess it's an open question. I mean, the demand for U.S. dollars obviously has to do with international commodities, the price of oil, the fact that you guys have the deepest capital markets, at least as far as I know right now. I haven't looked at China for a while. Relatively well regulated. We can debate that, but relatively well regulated markets, and then a huge middle class and consumer base. Europe has some of those things, but they're far less, I think, unified than say the United States. There's some similarities, but I really think it's nascent, or it's just kind of starting out, because you have very different political cultures, let's call it that, across the European Union. And whilst they are ostensibly working together as a union and do have common policies, I think there's still kind of a ways to go in the way that they develop economic policy and fiscal policy and so on and so forth.
I agree with you on that. I think what is interesting to me is, while there has been relative American decline, everybody else's decline has also happened almost like concurrently in such a way that like the relative power balance actually really hasn't changed that much. There's been a little movement towards China, but not a lot.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, the other thing I guess I didn't really say is that Europe doesn't have a lot of energy, and we're seeing this, with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, right? The U.S. still has, a considerable amount of oil, natural gas, and coal. Europe, and depends where we look, still has some wood energy, still has some coal, a bit of natural gas, but in general, they're reliant on the international market for petroleum in particular, natural gas in a lot of cases, as we're seeing, and even coal. So, and China is the same thing, right? China virtually has no oil, is completely reliant on international exchange for that. It does have some coal and natural gas, but it's not an energy superpower. And how the United States comes to the fore after World War II, and it was already starting to, flex its muscles, say, after World War I, is it was international oil giant, right? The big finds were all in the United States of America, particularly in Texas, right? So that, the United States was quote unquote Saudi Arabia before we even knew Saudi Arabia, had that much oil. And Europe doesn't have that and will never have that, right? So that means that they're reliant on the US dollar. That means they're reliant on international energy markets. So that's a key vulnerability. And I think China faces that as well.
I would agree. One thing I think is interesting, then people might go, well, why isn't Russia a superpower, since it is obviously an energy superpower? And I there would say, but it doesn't have a lot of commodity production. It seems to be just extractive. So that does matter. If you're not producing things other than energy to buy, you can't kind of set up a cycle to which recapture all this all this movement of currency, and thus
I think you're absolutely right. I think you're absolutely right about that, Derick. It's a real sad state of affairs on some level, because it has the potential to have a very, very large, middle class, a better kind of lifestyle for its people based on its energy resources. And I just think it's just it has, I don't want to call it economic mismanagement, because it's not even that. I think it's just the oligarchical economy, and the fact that extraction goes to, what is it, 20 individuals or something.
Right.
There's a very, very tiny middle class that can afford a few things, and then the rest of the people are kind of just getting by.
Right.
So yeah.
Yes, it's a very tiny middle class. It's very centralized in Moscow. Extraction does get about 20 people. And I will say the Soviet Union does have a little bit of blame for this setup, because when Khrushchev moved to propose that they start building consumer productive energy industries, because they were under a nuclear umbrella. And if you have nukes, you don't really need a big army. He was, kind of removed from power shortly thereafter, and they put most of that capacity into building the army. And that didn't change when the oligarchs took over in the great, draining of Russia in the 90s. So I agree. I always think, like, there's a history to why this happens, and there's a reason why people who have been like, well, why can't Russia and China come together and just form a counterpower? They have a big military. Russia has all the resources. China has all the productive capacity. And I'm like, but they're all integrated into this system in which the U.S. basically set up after it inherited the system set up by the British, before World War II, and that's how the power game has been played and still is played.
Well, absolutely right. Absolutely right.
So I guess some people might go, well, then why is energy, why is all this inflation affecting the average American person? And I think the clear answer is they just don't care. I mean, and I think this is even reflected in policy, not just in Fed policy. Like, for example, while I do think the decreasing of energy policy is important, and that's a big part of the Fight Inflation Act, there's no provisions for food. There's no and in the U.S. right now, it has something. Just looking at this, we have 13% inflation in food in specific. Like, so that is disproportionately felt by the poor.
Absolutely. Well, it's definitely, whenever prices rise, I mean, it's obviously going to affect the most vulnerable first and foremost. The other thing that you rightly point out, Derick, is that obviously, I think it's an old Spanish saying, is like, there's only 7 meals before anarchy. So, like, people can skip 7 meals, and then, after that, anarchy. And what probably a lot of people don't recognize, because a lot of people aren't farmers now, I think it's like maybe 5% of the population might be still farmers or something like that. Depending on
that or less, even.
that or less. So we don't really know how our food is grown. We just go to the supermarket. We expect it to be there, but that's intimately related to fossil fuels, right? So without natural gas, we can't get nitrogen fertilizers. Oil is involved pretty much in every step of the way, from pesticides, herbicides, to packaging, refrigeration, transport of our food, and so on and so forth. So if you increase the cost of basic energy, in particular oil, but we can also add natural gas and coal, you're going to increase the price of food, because obviously businesses will generally try and pass on those costs to their consumers, again, because of cost plus accounting.
Right.
So they might absorb a little bit, maybe they'll lessen their profit margins or markups by a bit. But in general, if they have enough power and hold over the consumer base, they'll just pass on the costs to those consumers to achieve whatever profit target they have.
And they've been doing that. I mean, that's the thing. Profits have not gone down even in this recession. I mean, except for, I would say that in general, profits haven't gone down, except for, it seems like, in the shift from low inflation environment, a low inflation, low credit environment to a high inflation environment, there's been a shift on the industries which bear the brunt of the cost. The poor is always good. Like in COVID, the poor paid. They also pay now. It like that's not changed. How they pay is how they're paying for it is different.
Yeah.
But for example, like tech industries are disproportionately affected by prices of credit.
Yeah.
Uh, and because they're tied into rents, both their cost to operate and their ability to capture rents is highly affected by the cost of credit. So we're seeing them get hit hard, and whereas everybody else is still showing record profits, kind of. So,
Right.
So you know, I think that's interesting, and it's interesting the political calculus about what parts of the economy are going to take the hit. And I think we have to admit that under quantitative easing category, this is another disagreement between myself and Montiers, but under quantitative easing categories, we have been deciding which sectors of the economy were actually going to take the hit. You know, and not just for our own country. I mean, basically for the world. Like, so I think that. You know, you didn't write that in your article, but it occurred to me as I was reading it. I've been thinking about that a lot. Like we seem to be favoring certain kinds of industries, like high tech producers, but not things that are rent seeking. We're giving, I mean, like the bill that we passed here in the States for chips is actually kind of ridiculous, the amount of money that it's going to go into that. And the EU has threatened to push back on that, and the World Bank, because it violates you know, some anti-competitive pricing rules. But of course, you know, the US has more power and the EU kind of doesn't. And so I highly doubt that will have any effect on US policy.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting, and I think you know, we'll have to have this conversation in, you know, 5 years' time to see where we're at, and you know, how these, you know, policies actually impact the U.S. economy and by extension the broader global political economy. I think. So I think we're just really at the very beginning, and I think if the argument I made in the Strange Matters piece holds, we'll find out that, you know, this increasing interest rates is not going to quell inflation, and on top of that, what we're going to see is a redistribution again, from the poor to the rich, right? As interest rates increase. So we'll see. We'll basically have another testing ground, I guess, with these increases. They're nowhere near what like Volcker did, but you never know where we're going to go, right? And ultimately, you know, it's still the same justification. We want to quell inflation. Well, it doesn't seem to work.
Well, this is what I wanted to talk to you about, because this is one thing where you and the non-monetarist Keynesians, which are increasingly fewer. As a side note, you know, one of the issues with Keynesianism after the 70s is like no one's willing to be honest about the fact that Keynes' answer to inflation, in so much that there is one in Keynes, is taxation, and that's politically unviable. So we're just going to mess with the money supply too. But regardless, one thing I think that we have kind of seen, as well as everybody has seemingly been unable to entirely see, like every major prediction I've seen in the last 2 years has kind of been just squashed. But at the same token, the nakedness of the power relations part of it has become more and more openly stated. Like Jerome Powell has more or less, you know, said, and Larry Summers has said, that they need to squash the new power of labor post-COVID, since, you know, there's been a large exodus of the workforce to retirement, illness, and home care, to the tone, I think, of about 6 million positions.
Crazy.
In the U.S. alone, and I don't even know about Um,
The rest of the world.
yeah, about the rest of the world, I know it's similarly um, uh, it's similarly kind of sporadic like that. There's been a lot of, I mean, the baby boom is ending anyway, and would have eventually just been accelerated.
Yeah.
So they're stating that openly, and yet by their calculations and by their statement of political economy, even by their numbers, labor cannot be contributing more than 1% to the inflationary cost by their standing, right? Which I
Yeah.
don't
No.
believe. I don't even think it's doing
Yeah.
that, but
Hmm. Hmm.
because inflation
Yeah.
has outpaced any wage gain by a lot. So
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. So that's even a non-starter for me. You know what I
mm,
mean? Like that's yeah. No way. And especially in the United States, where we've been seeing, and it has happened here in Australia as well. Unionization has just gone gradually down. So any power that kind of organized labor had is few and far between. And certainly not parallel with what they had maybe in say the '60s in the United States. On top of that, yeah, sure, there's some labor shortages here and there. To what degree can like in an environment where you don't have collective bargaining or very little collective bargaining, you're still at the liberty for your employer to set your wage, even if there is a labor shortage. So yes, did wages go up, for example, here in Australia? I just have kind of anecdotal evidence of that. Yeah, slightly, but usually how it works here is that there's an award based on age and industry,
mhm.
and that's kind of set by the government. And maybe there's a band in the sense that your employer can maybe give you, say, instead of $16 an hour, maybe $19 an hour to incentivize you, or maybe even break that band and pay you higher. But again, if you're still looking for work and you want money, um, and you don't, you're not part of a union, you generally will take what you're given, right? You can shop around for the highest wage that you can possibly get, but that's very time consuming, and you might have to travel and commute and so on and so forth. So I'm very wary about these arguments that somehow after COVID, I'm not saying there isn't a labor shortage in some sectors of the economy. What I'm saying is um, that I'm doubtful that labor has, a lot of power to determine exactly what their remuneration will be, if that makes sense.
Yes, I think there's a lot going on there. For one thing, the remuneration issue. For example, like I have pointed out to people that even with the average raise increasing to what roughly
Mm.
just below $15, which is what the aim was 11 years ago,
Yeah,
for
that's right.
minimum wage, which adjusted for inflation before the last 2 years was up to something like 22. I think now it's probably like 27, $28 would be the actual purchasing power equivalent. Um, so you aren't really like there's not been real gains, and concurrently that and I've been somewhat frustrated by this. I don't know if you've been hearing this in Australia, but we're supposedly I'm sorry. I just got a comment on the commodity power of money,
Okay.
being paper, and plastic being the value of the money itself, because money is still commodity, as naturalized by the state of and that is an idiotic argument of even what Marx says. I just want
Mm.
to go ahead and like point that out there. Marx does not say that. In fact, in the Grundrisse, he talks about other forms of money than commodity money. Commodity
Mm.
money historically tends to exist when there's high distrust between nations. Now, that's not from Marx, that's from anthropology. You can argue with
Mm.
the past if you want to. but talking about naturalized states from ideal positions deduced from a poor reading of Marx is a very bad way to do political economy.
Yeah,
Um,
agree.
so uh, let's talk about this a little bit more. You talk about we study power by its effect.
Mhm.
Why is that the useful way to study power?
Well, I think the quote comes from Herbert Marcuse, who is a academic and Marxist theorist, and I think sometimes it's very difficult to kind of know what people's intentions are, right? And especially in an organization, and especially where we're not privy to certain amounts of information. So you can just think about how documents get classified and so on and so forth. So I think you can kind of attribute intentions to the effects that you observe. So I think by kind of saying, all right, well, just to give you an example, um, well, what was the effect of increasing interest rates during the Volcker period, right? We can look at the impacts across the United States of America and the redistribution of income that happened during that period. And then we can also look at the debt trap that led to for most of the third world. So was it the intention of Volcker to do that? Or was it the intention of other agencies to encourage Volcker to do that? Open question, we'll never know, right? Was it the intention, for example, of U.S. strategic thinkers to get OPEC to boost the price of oil by 400% in 1973 and 79? We'll never 100% know for sure, but we know the effects of what that happened, what that led to, and that was inflation. That was making debts harder to repay. That was making energy bills more expensive for the third world, who had to import most of its energy, and then made the debt trap, which they're ensnared in today, which makes them participate in international trade to sell their goods and services on the international market in order to make dollars to service these debts, which are perpetual. They're not going away, right? They only keep increasing. So that's what I mean by, okay, so well, we don't know 100% what the intentions might be, but we can look at the effects of certain policy decisions, right? And then go, okay, so even if it wasn't intended, what are the effects on the ground, and how, does that affect, the everyday lives of people on the ground?
Mhm.
Mm.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And let's switch that back over to carbon, though. Why is carbon so crucial to your understanding of this notion of power? Like, why is energy?
Yeah, I mean, it's fundamentally at the root of everything, and I think everything is when I was coming up um, as a young political economist or whatever, you tend to most people who do this career, especially in academia, they focus on one thing. Like I'm going to be an expert on international trade of Cabbage Patch Kids, or I'm going to focus on this one little nitty gritty. And the tradition I grew up in, going to York University in Toronto, is kind of a macro level tradition. So this is Robert Cox. This is Stephen Gill, who is my PhD supervisor, and they always thought at kind of this meta level. It's hard to do, obviously, to think holistically, because the world is very, very complex, and sometimes it is maybe better to be parsimonious and focus in on one or two little things. But as I started doing my research and figuring things out, and what and again, it's idiosyncratic in the sense of what you're interested in, right? I just started seeing everything as interconnected. Fundamentally, we are a fossil fuel based civilizational order, that's only been 300 years in the making, right? And very, very difficult, as we know, to dismantle overnight, right? And the funny thing is, my dad worked for Dow Chemical when I grew up in Sarnia, Ontario. And what sustained the town was what we called Chemical Valley. And basically, that was your Suncor, your Esso, Dow Chemical, you name it, Polisar. It was there, and making plastics of various kinds and so on and so forth. And I just knew Dad went to work and he went to Dow Chemical, had no clue when I was, young man, young teenager, that, the whole social order, rises and falls on the cost of energy, and particularly fossil fuels. And it was only when I was probably in my late 20s when I realized all that, and then started kind of researching it a little bit more into it. So I think the claim that I make in carbon capitalism is that you can't get the level and scale of accumulation, um, without fossil fuels. That so they go together. Without this, so the definition of energy is, um, capacity to do work, right? And so more energy means more capacity to do work. We can translate that into productivity. So the more things that you can accumulate, and of course, we're not just accumulating things. Where the goal is really to accumulate money, at least at the upper echelons of our social order. So if that falls down, and for example, BP, British Petroleum, who keeps the best stats on this, says we've got about 50 to 55 years worth of oil production left at current production rates. So what's going to happen over the next 2 years? So this might be just even a litmus test of what might happen to energy prices going forward, and what that might do to everyday people and their everyday lives.
Yeah, I think particularly in the case of Europe, which is relatively energy insecure, but energy insecurity seems to be, if we're honest, it's going to be a larger and larger problem. Like,
yeah, I agree. I absolutely agree. Could you imagine? And we're not even talking about, imagine if fossil fuel subsidies went away. Imagine if the externalities of pollution and carbon were priced in. How what would happen to the American society if for a gallon of gasoline it cost $25?
the entire work operation starts to fall apart. Not just and
There
a
you
way
go.
that couldn't even be foisted entirely upon the working class.
No.
It would
Yeah.
actually cause what we might use in Marxist terminology a social reproduction crisis.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
it would be
So I think.
yeah. Yeah.
Well,
I bet
I
it was
think.
minimally lead to an inflation spiral from hell, but yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's I think what's going to end up happening over time. So you know, like I said before, this has been a civilizational order about 3 centuries in the making. It's historically exceptional. The exploitation of fossil fuels is historically exceptional, at least at the scale. And we know they're non-renewable. And by definition, a society that relies on a non-renewable source of energy is itself non-renewable, right? Or as you suggested, its form of social reproduction will be non-renewable.
Mm-hmm.
So, as Marx said, the kind of new society is always built within the womb of the old, right? Or starts to come up within the womb of the old. And we're starting to see little kind of well springs of renewable energy here and there, but it's by far still absolutely marginal to the global political economy. We're still reliant in the OECD. I think about 80% fossil fuels for our energy. So this is something that we really need to change, and workers of the world, if they're interested in the future and future generations, need to be pressing on our politicians, organizing, to get off fossil fuels as fast as we can, or at least decarbonize as much as we can, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's. I'm really influenced by the work of Joseph Tainter, and I actually think there's a whole lot of social changes that we need to make don't happen in ways that would reduce the kind of energy sinks into very complex systems and cost disease spirals and this and the other, that we're basically doomed. Like I don't know that we. I mean that in like almost a pessimistic sense, like almost the most pessimistic sense. Like you start seeing social stagnation and like he actually states out, societies that have hit this on their energy costs where they just basically can't can't figure out how to lower their energy cost to simplify their society, and they stagnate and then they collapse just totally. And usually there's a fair amount of death and war and stuff associated with that. And he's like, well, and there's never been a global society before, so and now there is. Capitalism has achieved, a global society in the real sense, and that is another insight of Marx. So, and right now, and we don't know. Someone's asked me, what are the technical hard limits to solar power? And I'm like, we don't know right now, but we do not have anything that is as energy rich per unit expended as fossil fuels. We don't yet. I guess except for nuclear power, but that has many other comorbid problems.
Yeah, well, that's right, and uranium is also non-renewable substance anyhow. So
right.
So we can't. It's basically. I think if you look at Vaclav Smil's work, who's probably the best on this, I think he's an emeritus professor now from University of Winnipeg, but he's written on energy his whole life, and from kind of he's a scientist, but he kind of writes for a social science audience to understand energy and civilization and so on and so forth. And he's always said energy transitions they're always protracted. It's not like we just switch to a new source overnight, and that this is going to be very, very difficult. Quest. We're probably, you and I, living at, arguably because of where we live, probably in one of the best times in human history. And so far as we consider, what we can consume, how we can travel, sanitation, medical practice, access to care, all that kind of stuff, right? And I often wonder, what it will look like, say, 30, if not 50 years on from here. What does the energy situation look like? What's going on with the climate emergency? What's going on with international trade? All these questions are really fascinating and open. But and without kind of understanding the relationship between energy and money, I think we're really at a loss. So we can have all this stuff and we can circulate all this currency because we have a surplus capacity rooted in fossil fuel energy.
Right. I mean, it's interesting because there were research programs that kind of realized this as early as the 1920s. I mean, that I don't normally sing the praises of Technocracy Inc., but they were talking about money's direct relationship to energy consumption, and energy consumption direct relationship to labor power. So they were still dealing with even some Marxist concepts as early as like 1921, 1922, and they kind of just fade out towards the Second World War. And I think that it is not surprising that there's always an energy shock associated with a major inflation spike. I think and that's, sometimes you will hear more orthodox, heterodox. I hate the fact we use orthodox and heterodox to refer to economists. I think it's really confusing. But let's say we use, say, post-Keynesians, our more left-wing neo-Keynesian assumptions about most of this being driven by policy, and I think there's some truth to that. However, there's no single state's policy that could actually have totally predicted what happened with oil in the 1970s, even though it was not a problem of scarcity. That is absolutely clear. But we will have problems of scarcity coming up. I mean, there is indications that in many fields we are already at the point where we're putting in almost as much energy to get energy out, just so we don't have to sink the cost of investing in new infrastructure. That we are there, like that peak oil may have already happened. And just
I think the peak of conventional oil probably has. I mean, this is obviously debated, and we only kind of know in hindsight. But the peak of conventional oil probably has already hit. To what extent that's true, we probably won't know for maybe 10 more years. But Yeah, and obviously a lot of things kind of impact, consumption. So obviously COVID, which only very few people anticipated, that decreased consumption of oil and maybe gave us a few extra years of oil reserves because of reduced travel and mobility and so on and so forth. So, but the fact that we're heading in that way and we're continuing to consume an inordinate amount of fossil fuels, despite the climate emergency and our knowledge that they're non-renewable resources, we're basically kind of in a position of what a colleague of mine would call carbon lock-in. We built an environment for fossil fuels, and now we just continue to have to consume fossil fuels in order to socially reproduce that built environment and our activity in that built environment, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's actually totally. It's concerning. I mean, I'm gonna address some questions from the audience. We won't be addressing the ones on centerage and the cost of plastic, but I would this one. Michael Newman asked, I saw Steve King suggest that one motivation for the rate hike is to drive China out of, or at least minimize, the U.S. Treasury market. Is there any truth to this? And I personally think it's hard to know, but I'm going to turn that over to you, because as an effect, it doesn't seem to be exactly what's happening.
Yeah, that's interesting. I know Steve Keen, but I haven't seen that comment. So I'm probably not informed enough to kind of make a statement on that. Actually have to look that up and research it a bit. But yeah, no, I'd have to think about that a little bit more. Sorry about that.
Mm-hmm. No problem. That's one of those things where I'm also like, well, if we were looking at effects right now, actually yuan percentage of the reserve of the reserve has actually grown, but not at the expense of the dollar, at the expense of other parts of the commodity basket. So mostly like a decline in euros. There has been some attempt to move away from the dollar because right now, if you think the inflation effects in America are bad, if you're a country who's having to purchase dollars on an open market, it seems to me that you're going to be hit even harder. And I think the UK is finding out that the real hard way right now, because it also has what is it, inflation adjusted bonds. So that's really going to hurt it. And the price of the dollar will thus affect UK bonds, which is not something that seems intuitive at all, but is definitely true.
Yeah. Well, right now we're basically running a real world experiment with the increase in interest rates. So again, we'll have to kind of think about what happens, 5 years down the track and whatnot. It almost seems impossible that the rate increases will go as high as what they did in the Volcker shocks, but you never know. So
well, I mean,
again,
if it does, it will prove or disprove a whole lot of theories of value.
Yeah, that's right, Derick. Yeah, absolutely right. Yeah.
I mean, one of the things I was actually thinking about is, while I agree with you that the exiting of the labor force is somewhat overstated, there has been, if that is true, and if they are serious about that's what's causing inflation, the logical deduction that you would have to make is to save profits for some sectors of the economy. You would literally need to basically crash the economy almost to Great Depression levels, because you have, if they're right about the expansion of labor power, because of fewer people in the market, and that, thus having more bargaining power, then and if they're right that that's the only factor of inflation they can really control with the interest rates, because all the other justifications are kind of gone, then to actually significantly hit that when when there's a bunch of needs that have to be met, and these require new workers in the United States. There's significant calls for reshoring and whatnot because of
Yeah.
supply chain fragility, etc. That to think about what that would mean, it would mean to hit the economy very, very hard. And it almost as if they would know that would actually induce inflation. But I wanted to, I guess, maybe to wrap this up. Oddly, I'm going to go back to your article. I was interested in the fact that you're not the only person I've seen document this. I've also seen some post Keynesians document this, but that there really isn't a strong correlation at all between the Volcker shock and the decline of inflation. In fact, the Volcker shock happens something like 6 or 7 years before you actually see any inflation reduction of any significant amount.
Right, and I think generally, and I think that's chart number 7 in the. Wait, no, maybe chart 8, whatever. It doesn't matter the number. But the last chart in the article where I kind of map out inflation and the oil price, and you can see as oil prices are coming down, inflation is going down. So, cost of energy is getting less and less at that period. But of course, everyone attributes that to the high interest rates and the Volcker shock and the reduction in the money supply, which, as I show in the article as well, doesn't ever decrease, right? Because capitalism is a credit-based system. Even if you increase my parents went through the Volcker shocks and they still had a mortgage. They still had to service it, right? So people still take out loans, whether they're individuals taking out mortgages or families taking out mortgages or corporations having to borrow in order to expand production or increase R&D or whatever it might be. So, really, at the end of the day, I think, for your viewership, we have to keep our eye on energy prices. We have to keep our eye on Fed policy. And we really have to question kind of received truths, because I was really shocked, to kind of see this, because when I was coming up as a political economist, that's what I was, taught. And, so you take it as an article of faith, right? Until you look at the empirical detail. So it's kind of like, oh, well, what the Fed does is that if the economy is overheating and inflationary pressures are kind of increasing, then, well, just increase interest rates, and then that'll quell inflation. And so when I started looking at the empirical detail, which Jonathan Neetzen taught me to do in my master's and PhD schooling, and I looked at it and I was like, well, this isn't what we see at all, and this is crazy. And so that's how I pitched our editors over at Strange Matters, who graciously edited the article and accepted it. And this is why I'm talking to you today, Derick, because of their efforts.
Yeah, I mean, yes, and I'm glad that
shout out to them.
Yeah, the Strange Matters has done that. They have been. I mean, obviously they're friends of the show. I co-produce a podcast with them.
Oh yeah, cool.
I mean, I have an agreement with them on bringing their writers on, and although I usually suggest like who I find most interesting that month. So what I find interesting about this, I will say that why I have taken a sympathetic notion to power theory. I find power theory to be true in the case of rents. I am more skeptical on it in relationship to labor purchasing, but I will admit that I also find many of the counter arguments from Marxists to be a little non-empirical. They tend to be based on deductive logic from first principles.
Well, if you're more interested in that, Derick, what I would suggest is if you find an interesting person next month, find Jonathan Neetzen and have a chat with him, because he's the originator of the theory, along with Shimshon Bickler, his co-author, and he's fascinating to talk to. So if you get a chance to chat with him, he was my old professor. I think you and your viewership would really appreciate it, because he's got a lot to say, and I think he's a very interesting speaker as well.
Yeah. One thing I would also talk, to talk about this a little bit. One of the things I like about Strange Matters is, unfortunately, despite the whole concept of heterodox political economy, which or heterodox economics, they don't call it political economy, which is another
Yeah.
problem. But
Yeah.
um, uh, the that there are camps in this, and there's going to be camps in anything. There's camps in Marxism. There's
That's
probably
right.
camps in power theory of value that I don't even know.
Not as far as I know, but maybe.
Over
Yeah.
If you guys exist long enough, yeah, they will be eventually.
Yeah. That's right. That's right.
But there
Yeah.
are camps in MMT, even though they will tell you there aren't.
Right.
So it's, and I think one of the things that we have had, unfortunately, is like the camps don't really talk to each other, and none of them, empirically, everybody seemed to have been caught with their pants down around COVID. I will say, like, everybody
Sure.
seems to have been caught with their
Mhm.
pants down around
Yeah.
COVID. And that's been somewhat of a problem. And one of the things that I think Strange Matters has done, in your article, I think, is part of that, is try to come up with some theories of inflation that have some empirical grounding, and maybe also talk about the Fed's role being different than maybe it understands itself to be, or at least definitely different than what it's saying. Because
Yeah.
everything that I see indicates that, at best you can say, and I think we can say this, regardless of your theory of value, is the Federal Reserve quantity theory of money, as the way they deal with it through interest rates, has almost no empirical evidence of being directly correlated with inflation. Like that seems undeniable, and yet that is a truth generally believed in the general public, even amongst academics.
Yeah.
I guess one interesting question is kind of broad. What do we think is going on in the UK, as things seem, as I mentioned early on, things seem to be an almost free fall there. Like, it's productivity has dropped, dropped lower than, I saw it mapped with the EU and with the US, and it was significantly worse than either. But then even when you map it with China and India, it's significantly worse than them too. What do you think is happening? Is this, from the standpoint of power theory, what is going on there?
I just think it's primarily probably two things. One is the reliance on international trade for its social reproduction. It imports quite a lot of things in order to socially reproduce their society. And one of the other things, obviously, is the energy question of how they power their homes, their industry, and so on and so forth. And they've taken a massive hit there. And probably it doesn't help that investors are questioning the viability of Britain going alone after Brexit. So that might be one of the big factors as well. I haven't studied the UK case in any great detail. I just, my comments are based on what I've read in the press. So I probably can't really elaborate on that. I don't know that case very well, but yeah. Anyhow.
All right. I'd like to thank you for your time. Is there anything other than your books, which I think we mentioned both of them, Debt as Power and Carbon Capitalism? I have not read Debt as Power. I have read parts of Carbon. I read the first 3 chapters and skimmed the rest for the interview, but I did discover it.
Thanks, Derick. That's cool.
And I am actually looking forward to finishing it, because there's a lot of interesting insights in there.
Nice. Well, I'll do one plug, Derick, real quick. So a new book has just come out that I co-edited with a colleague of mine called Matt Dow, and it's called COVID-19 and the Global Political Economy Crises in the 21st Century, and that's with Routledge, and it's in their Review of International Political Economy RIPE series. So that's just out now. And my writing, so I've got 3 chapters in the book. Obviously 2 of the chapters are introduction and conclusion. But the one that you might be interested in is I wrote a piece on MMT and what we learned during the COVID crisis about that. So that was just when Stephanie Kelton's book hit, if you remember that one, the Deficit Myth, I think it was called.
Yeah.
So, anyways, if your readership is or viewership is interested, it's actually posted on my academia.edu site, so you can grab the chapter for free and give it a read if you're interested.
Yeah, I definitely will check that out because I am definitely interested in. I have felt like MMT has both been kind of made some overclaims that like, oh, we saw this coming. No, you didn't. But also, also a lot of the critiques I've seen in the popular press about MMT, for example, blaming them for what happened in Sri Lanka, is like ridiculous. It's just like not even kind of true. So
all right, exactly.
So I'd like to read that. I just to state my biases, I consider myself a frenemy of MMT. I find that getting Marxists to be even interested in Marxian political economy these days is actually really hard. So they'd much rather talk about some geopolitical something or other as if it was I guess cheerleading makes them feel good. And so sometimes I feel like it's actually the heterodox economists who are the only people even engaging in something like Marxist political economy. There are a few people still doing it, but there's not many. And that sometimes leaves me wanting because people assume that I'm an MMT or something because I have them on because they can talk about interest rates and political economy and this, that, and the other. But often I find their explanation, particularly for inflation, to be maddening. You know, or there's another problem that I have with them that I don't have with the power theory of value people is the assumption of economic systems being mostly closed systems of single nation states, which I just find to be just fundamentally not true.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, that's not true of all of them, but it's a lot of them have that problem. Like,
that's right. I agree. Well, thanks for having me on, Derick. Much appreciated. And this was a really pleasant discussion, and maybe we'll get to talk again in future.
Yeah, I hope so. Have a great rest of your day. I'm going to end up our day here in the States and enjoy the down under, I suppose.
Same to you, mate. You take care.
All right. Take care. Bye-bye. Cheers.